Welcome, traveller. Tonight, I will guide you through the complete lore of Hallownest, SilkSong, a tale that spans generations, chronicling the rise and fall of kingdoms, the rebellion of daughters against their mother, and the journey of one princess who would determine the fate of an entire realm. But before we begin, I discovered that most of you watching haven't subscribed to the channel. Please do. It really helps out and takes a lot of time to make these videos. Now, close your eyes and let yourself drift into the haunted kingdom of Farloom, a land of silk and sorrow, where ancient spiders once wove the fate of civilizations, and where a pale being sleeps in a cradle at the world's peak. Let us begin. Long before the citadel pierced the sky, long before the bells rang out across pilgrim roads, Farloom was a different world entirely. The lands we now know as the Sea of Karak were not windswept deserts, but thriving underwater kingdoms, blue seas teeming with life. Where toxic sludge now festers in bile water, pristine streams once fed fertile soil. The regions of Farloom existed in a state of natural abundance, an age of verdure where bug civilizations lived in harmony with the wild growth around them. In this primordial time, great kingdoms rose from the abundance of the land. 3 civilizations gained particular prominence, each carving their mark into history through strength, discipline, and cunning. In the seas of Karak, the Crust Kingdom established its reign. Led by Crust King Khan, this society of warrior bugs built their power upon the blade. The coral that grew naturally in their waters became not just shelter, but weapon, fused into their armaments and fortifications. The Karak blade bug and the Karak legions were fearless and faithful, an entire kingdom built upon martial prowess. From his coral tower, Khan ruled over his warriors, the most fearsome among a fearsome people. To the east, in lands of green growth and disciplined order, the Scar made their home. These were the Ant Legions, united under the voice of their song queen, Scar Singer Carmelita. Her voice was her power and her gift, used to unite and uplift her tribe, to lead them in combat, and to bind them together as one people. The Scar were hunters and warriors, bold in their stalking, proud in their roaming, travelling far from their origins to establish new nests and new homes in the lands that would become Farloom. Between the waters of Karak and the groves of the Scar lay Verdania, a kingdom of unequalled beauty. Here, aquatic grace combined with verdant splendour to create something unique in all the world. Verdania was ruled not by one monarch but by 2 princes, born together, joined by oath, joined by love, joined by blade. These twin rulers, known as the Clover Dancers, were beloved by their subjects for their grace and for the deadly ballet they performed upon any who threatened their realm. The princes shepherded their kingdom with care, their ruler partnership that seemed destined to last through the ages. Other civilizations existed in this time as well, though their scope and scale remain uncertain. Far above Farloom proper, on the surface of the world, a nameless town stood, its people living lives we can now only glimpse through ruins and fragments. How many such settlements existed? How far their influence spread? These details have been lost to the erosion of time and the deliberate forgetting that would come later. At the ancient heart of what would become Shellwood, a primordial being existed. Nylith, described as a plant-like entity, was the first seed from which the great forest grew. Connected to all living things within Shellwood, Nylith operated under a benevolent directive: to grow, to settle, to seed, to twist and wind and protect and maintain the delicate but healthy ecosystem of the forest. Under Nileth's influence, Shelwood became a place of profound natural power, a verdant sanctuary in an already abundant world. This was the world before the arrival of the Pale Being. This was Farloom in its innocence, before devotion became chains, before song became imprisonment, before the threads of fate and silk ensnared every living soul. Into this world of thriving kingdoms and natural abundance came a being of immense power, a pale being known as Grandmother Silk. Pale beings, as we know from the history of Hallownest, are a particular strain of higher being, creatures that stand above all others in power and ambition. The Pale King who ruled Hallownest, the White Lady who was his queen, these were pale beings, and their rule was marked by total dominion over lesser creatures. The Radiance, the Nightmare's heart. These were higher beings, but not pale beings, a distinction that seems to matter in ways we do not fully understand. Grandmother Silk possessed the qualities that define her kind. She was immensely powerful, capable of creating and manipulating the substance from which she took her name. She desired veneration, sought out bugs to dominate and rule, as though faith and devotion could strengthen her reserve of soul, that powerful life essence that permeates the world of Hollow Knight. As Hornet herself would later observe when speaking with the caretaker of the first shrine, pale beings inherently desire this veneration, this subjugation of those beneath them. Grandmother Silk is described as the primal source of all silk in Farloom, and perhaps in the entire world of Hollow Knight. This substance, fine thread spun from the soul of its creator, possesses remarkable properties. Silk can heal wounds, extend life, and be woven into powerful runes capable of extraordinary effects. The weavers of Deepnest in Hallownest, the spiders who would later serve under Hera the Beast, they too produced silk and used it to create stories, shields, and spells. Their silk came from Farloom, brought when they fled from the land of their origin. The implication is profound. Grandmother Silk may be the source of all silk in the world, her power the wellspring from which this mystical substance flows. When Grandmother Silk arrived in Farloom, the thriving civilizations that had prospered there began their long decline. The exact timeline of events is difficult to establish with certainty, but we know that her arrival marked a turning point from which the kingdoms of Karak, the Scar and Verdania would never recover. The abundant lands began their slow transformation into the depleted regions Hornet would later traverse. Rather than directly subjugating the existing kingdoms, whose rulers possessed strong wills and established power, Grandmother Silk chose a different path. She would create her own race, beings who would be innately bound to her, who would serve her will without question, who would shower her with the devotion and song that pale beings seem to crave above all else. The creation of the Weavers is revealed in one of the most significant memories in all of SilkSong, the dream sequence witnessed when confronting the first sinner. In this vision, we see the moment of transformation, the elevation of lesser creatures into something greater and more terrible. Grandmother Silk took Farlids, or perhaps another arachnid species that existed in abundance in Farloom, and blessed them with her silken touch. These common bugs were transformed, elevated in mind and ability, granted intellect and power far beyond their original nature. The Weavers, as they came to be called, were gifted with remarkable abilities. Within their own shells they could produce silk, the mystical substance that was the essence of their mother's power. They could manipulate this silk with extraordinary skill, weaving it into magical runes that could accomplish wondrous and terrible things. They could create advanced technologies, as evidenced by the sophisticated equipment found in the weave nests scattered throughout Farloom. Perhaps most significantly, they could strum melodies, lilting songs that clouded minds and bent wills, allowing them to influence and control other bugs with their music. The weavers represented a new pinnacle of bug civilization in Farloom. As the midwife in Deepness would later recall, amazing things the weavers once crafted on their looms. Stories, shields, spells. So much of history was spun upon their spools. They were artisans and warriors, builders and mystics, a race that combined intellect and savagery within graceful shells. Grandmother Silk named the weavers her children, called them her daughters, proclaimed them divine. The weavers, lacking any memory of their previous existence as simple creatures, accepted this narrative without question. They believed themselves to be God-born, special and sacred, elevated by nature rather than by the deliberate act of their creator. They willingly served their mother, established a great civilization in her name, and became the instruments through which Grandmother Silk would expand her influence across all of Farloom. But buried deep within this act of creation was a terrible truth. The weavers were not divine, they were not special by nature. They were simply mortal beasts raised in ability to shower their creator with faith and devotion. They were slaves, elevated in form but bound in purpose, created solely to serve the will of Grandmother Silk. This truth, hidden from their collective memory, would remain concealed for a long time. But truths have a way of emerging no matter how deeply they are buried. Under the guidance and command of Grandmother Silk, the weavers established what would become the Kingdom of Farloom. Their civilization grew in power and sophistication, advancing far beyond any other bug society in the known world. The decline of the other kingdoms, which had begun with Grandmother Silk's arrival, accelerated under weaver influence. The weavers inherited their mother's ability to captivate lesser minds through song. This power, represented in the game by the needle-in that Hornet acquires, allowed the weavers to mesmerize bugs, to calm even maddened creatures with their melodies, to bend wills and shape desires. Using this ability, the weavers launched what can only be described as a campaign of psychological conquest. They sang sweet promises to bugs throughout the lands, whispered of a great purpose, beckoned them to come and join in something grander than themselves. The Nidolin dialogue associated with the corpse, found in the ruins of the nameless town, tells part of this story. Friends seduced, sweet promises whispered, the weaving ones beckon. The residents of that town on the surface, along with bugs from many other settlements, were drawn down into Farloom by the weavers' songs. They came willingly, believing they were being called to something holy, something worthy of devotion and sacrifice. The kingdoms that had once thrived in Farloom found themselves unable to resist this subtle conquest. Crust King Khan and his warriors, whose order had occupied half the lands of Farloom at the height of their power, stood as one of the last groups to resist Grandmother Silk's influence. But even their martial prowess could not stand against the insidious pull of weaver song. By the time Hornet would arrive in Farloom, Khan's kingdom would be all but forgotten, his lands eroded by sand, his warriors reduced to corpses maintaining their formations even in death. Skarzinga Carmelita, whose voice had united the Scar tribe, found her own power insufficient against the tide of change. The Scar became lost without a true nest. Uncertain if the song they heard was still their queen's or something else entirely, Carmelita herself would endure through the ages, but her form would wither, her power faded by time, until she became a withered frame of her former glory. Verdania, with its twin princes and unequalled beauty, attempted to negotiate with the advancing power of Grandmother Silk's kingdom. In a desperate bid to avoid destruction, one of the princes gave his life as tribute to the Weaver realm. The sacrifice proved futile. Verdania fell to ruin anyway, its verdant lands reduced to barren caverns, its beauty extinguished, leaving only memories and the grief of the surviving prince who had lost everything. Even Nilith, the primordial plant being who had sown the first seed of Shellwood, disappeared during this age. The forest Nilith had nurtured would endure, still filled with life when Hornet arrived, not yet fully snuffed out by Grandmother Silk's influence. But Nilith itself was gone. Whether destroyed or departed, we cannot say with certainty. The decline of these civilizations was not entirely abrupt. Clues within the game suggest this was a gradual process, a slow decay fed by the will of Grandmother Silk and enacted through the songs and schemes of her weaver daughters. The transformation of the Sea of Karak from thriving underwater beauty to windswept desert would have required immense time. The fact that the mortal scar-singer Carmelita, though reduced and withered, still lives when Hornet arrives suggests that perhaps not as many generations passed as the environmental changes would indicate. Or perhaps Carmelita's life was extended through some application of silk or soul, allowing her to endure far beyond a normal span. Regardless of the exact timeline, the result was clear. Under Weaver guidance, Farloom became the dominant force in the region. A religion developed in which the Weavers were seen as divine children of the god Grandmother Silk. Enthralled bugs exalted them in song and action, showering them with devotion and service. The Weavers, believing in their own divinity, accepted this worship as their due. They had created a golden age for themselves, a time when they stood at the pinnacle of bug civilization, revered and powerful. But beneath this golden age, two forces were in tension. The Weavers, despite their elevated status, remained bound to serve their mother. And within that service lay the seed of rebellion. During this golden age of Weaver civilization, when they were revered as divine and ruled over the subjugated kingdoms of Farloom, the Weavers performed a crucial duty. They sustained what was known as the Eternal Song, a continuous musical performance that Grandmother Silk required from her daughters. A glimpse of this service appears in the Silk memory of Widow, the only Weaver who would remain loyal to Grandmother Silk even after her siblings fled. In this memory, we see Weavers playing harps while Grandmother Silk watches over them. The dialogue accompanying this vision reveals the nature of their task. For her light, eternal, our song sustains. The harps they played can still be found in the cradle at the top of the citadel, fallen completely into disuse, relics of a time when the Weavers directly served their mother. Another silk heart. Memory found in Whitewood provides insight into Grandmother Silk's desires and perspective. The pale being's voice speaks through the memory. Their voices, their song to devote eternal, they are ours, bound forever. The possessive language is revealing. Grandmother Silk viewed the Weavers as her property, creatures who existed solely to provide her with devotion and song. For the Weavers, this eternal obligation must have been a growing burden. Despite their belief in their own divinity, despite the worship they received from lesser bugs, they were still servants themselves, required to continuously perform for their mother's pleasure. This song could not cease. The devotion could not waver. Their lives, no matter how elevated they appeared to others, were not their own. At some point this burden became intolerable, whether it was the endless nature of the obligation or the gradual realization that they were not truly free, or some other catalyst. The weavers began to question their situation. And in that questioning, in that first stirring of independent thought, lay the beginning of their rebellion. The catalyst for the weavers' rebellion against Grandmother Silk appears to have been a single individual, known to history as the first sinner. Her story is one of the most tragic and significant in all of Farlum's history, and piecing together the fragments of her tale requires careful attention to the clues scattered throughout the game. The first sinner can be found deep in the slab, Farlum's prison complex, behind doors marked with the word apostasy, and bound within a cage sealed with powerful silk runes. A law tablet placed over her cage provides her formal accusation. Penitent first of the first, guilty of the sin of apostasy, penance by constriction, absolution denied. Apostasy is the abandonment or renunciation of a religious belief, and the first sinner earned her name by being the first among weavers to turn against the religion of Grandmother Silk, the first to speak heresy and declare that the foundation of their civilization was a lie. When Hornet approaches the cage, she finds a weaver corpse within. The first sinner offers to bind her strength to Hornet's, much like the other weaver corpses scattered throughout Farlum. But unlike those others, this action awakens something in the first sinner, and Hornet finds herself pulled into a memory, a fight that takes place not in the physical world, but in some preserved moment of the past. Dying in this fight does not spawn a cocoon, confirming that this is not a true resurrection, but rather a lingering echo, a memory preserved in silk. If Hornet defeats the first sinner in this memory battle, she witnesses a vision that reveals the truth of weaver origins. In this crucial scene, we see the moment Grandmother Silk transformed simple Farlids into the weavers. We witness the act of elevation, the blessing that was also a binding, the gift that was also a curse, and we hear the first sinner's response to this revelation. She called us daughters, called us divine, she lied. How did the first sinner discover this truth that Grandmother Silk had kept hidden from the collective memory of the weavers? The game provides some tantalizing clues. The first sinner's hunter's journal entry notes, "This one's husk held a masterful talent to weave silk into blazing runes. Throughout my life, I've seen runes woven for many tasks." Was she the first to hone such skills? The entry suggests the first sinner was exceptionally skilled in silk manipulation, perhaps the most skilled of all weavers in the mystic art. From the webbed aesthetic of memories and their connection to silk-fueled entities throughout the game, it appears that memories of Farlum's past are tied to silk itself. Perhaps the first sinner's extraordinary skill in weaving allowed her to access the most distant, most restricted memories contained within silk. Perhaps in exploring the depths of her power, she accidentally uncovered the memory of her own people's transformation, the hidden truth that Grandmother Silk had deliberately concealed. The first sinner's needle-in dialogue during the boss fight reveals her anguish. Cursed by silk, cursed with silk, cursed to know the sin, the truth, cursed to know. She views her knowledge as a curse, a burden that destroyed her peace and any illusion of purpose. She was cursed by the silk that gave her power, cursed with the silk that bound her to servitude, and cursed to know the truth that her entire existence was a lie. There is another possibility for how the first sinner learned the truth. Deep in the abyss beneath Farloom, in a region that connects to the same void-filled depths found beneath Hallownest, there exists a weave nest called Absalom. This weave nest contains evidence of void research, including glass jars filled with the dark substance and runes depicting void tendrils. The void is a force that exists in opposition to soul and to the influence of higher beings. It's possible that the first sinner's exposure to void, perhaps during research conducted in Weavenest Absalom, severed Grandmother Silk's connection to her mind, liberating her from the mental conditioning that prevented weavers from questioning their origins. Regardless of how she learned the truth, the first sinner's response was to rebel. She became apostate, renouncing the religion of Grandmother Silk and declaring the weaver's supposed divinity to be a lie. Her rebellion appears to have inspired others, as she speaks of our silk, our rage during the fight, possibly implying that other weavers joined her in anger against their creator. The response from the weaver leadership and from Grandmother Silk was swift and absolute. The first sinner was imprisoned in the slab, bound in a cage sealed with runes, forced to endure eternity in a near-death state. Penance by constriction, absolution denied. She would never be forgiven, never be released, left to exist in perpetual punishment as a warning to others who might question the established order. The cage that holds the first sinner bears the symbol of the citadel, the image of a silk cocoon inside a crook that would become the emblem of Farloom's religious system. This strongly suggests that the first sinner was imprisoned not by Grandmother Silk directly, but by her fellow weavers, by the leadership of the society that would later build the citadel. They imprisoned one of their own to protect their claim to divinity, to prevent the truth from spreading and destroying the foundation of their power over the lesser bugs of Farloom. This interpretation is significant. It suggests that at least some weavers learned the truth of their origins and chose to suppress it rather than acknowledge it. They would rather imprison one of their own sisters than admit they were not divine beings. Perhaps they believed they had no choice, that revealing the truth would cause their carefully constructed web of religious control to collapse. Perhaps they had grown to enjoy their position of power and privilege too much to give it up. Or perhaps they simply could not face the existential horror of learning that their entire existence was a lie, that they were nothing more than elevated slaves. Whatever their reasoning, the imprisonment of the first sinner represents a crucial moment in Weaver history. It demonstrates how far the Weavers would go to maintain their false narrative of divinity. It shows their willingness to betray one of their own in service of that lie, and it foreshadows the lengths to which they would eventually go when they realized that maintaining their control over Farloom had become impossible. But the first sinner's revelation, though suppressed, could not be entirely erased. Knowledge, once gained, has a way of spreading, even when those who possess it try to bury it. And the truth she discovered would eventually lead to a rebellion that would reshape Farloom forever. The discovery of the Weaver's true origins, whether it remained confined to the first sinner alone or spread to others of her kind, set in motion a period of upheaval that would fundamentally alter Farloom. What followed was nothing less than a civil war, a conflict between Grandmother Silk and her rebellious daughters, with the fate of the entire kingdom hanging in the balance. The exact scope and duration of this war are difficult to determine with certainty. The environmental changes that occurred during this period, the construction of elaborate defensive and research facilities, and the references to generations of conflict All suggest this was not a brief uprising, but a prolonged struggle. Farloom became a kingdom divided, with weavers fighting for their freedom against the pale being who had created them, and against those bugs who remained enthralled to Grandmother Silk's will. Not all weavers joined the rebellion. Some, perhaps unable to accept the truth or too deeply conditioned by Grandmother Silk's influence, remained loyal to their mother. Others among the bug population of Farloom, their minds still clouded by weaver song and devotion to the pale being, took up arms against the rebels. The conflict became a war of religion as much as a war of liberation, with faith and truth colliding in violence that rattled the foundations of the kingdom. During this period of turmoil, the rebel weavers undertook several desperate measures to gain advantage against their mother. They constructed a network of secret tunnels known as weave nests, hidden facilities shrouded in some kind of warding power that blinded them to Grandmother Silk's vision. A lore tablet in Weaveness Atla explains their purpose. This low, her gaze escaped. Prepare, sisters. Weave hope anew that we might break free this accursed web born of our naive foundation. Within these weave nests, the rebel weavers experimented with their own silk abilities, attempting to develop weapons and tools that might allow them to overcome their creator. The ruins of 5 weaver nests can be explored in the game, though others may have existed and been lost to time. These facilities contained benches for rest, silk-powered blueprints, advanced technologies, and laboratories dedicated to studying and manipulating silk in ways that might break Grandmother Silk's hold. One of the most significant creations to emerge from the weave nests was the snare setter, a trap designed to bind and contain beings of immense power. A lore tablet in Weaveness Atla hints at its purpose, and the mysterious Eva, herself a failed weaver experiment, describes their efforts. There my mothers built their tools, all traps and bindings, small things but tests for larger forms. I still remember their thoughts as they worked, their desperation and their hunger. Another hopeless attempt to wrest their freedom. All ended in failure, of course. The snare setter and other binding devices represented the weaver's hope that they could capture and contain Grandmother Silk, removing her influence without destroying her entirely. But despite their skill and desperation, despite their advanced understanding of silk manipulation, these attempts failed. Grandmother Silk was simply too powerful, her connection to silk too fundamental, for the weavers to overcome her through these means. Another desperate experiment undertaken by the rebel weavers was the creation of Eva. Hidden deep within Weaveness Atla, Eva is a being unlike any other in Farloom, a creature confined to live her life within an iron shell. She's described as a child of the weavers, but created from rune and shell rather than through natural reproduction. A rune harp found near her location reveals the weavers' intent and their disappointment. Hide her deep, the despised child, our shame shown in shell of iron. She is a wish cast vain, divinity mimicked in form too frail. Eva was an attempt by the Yust weavers to create their own divine being, a creature spun entirely from silk who might possess the power to usurp or defeat Grandmother Silk. The parallels to later attempts by the Pale being herself to create silk-spun children are striking. Both the weavers and Grandmother Silk would attempt to birth loyal, powerful offspring through silk manipulation, and both would find that creating life from silk produced beings who were fragile, flawed, and not quite what was intended. Eva's failure left the rebel weavers with increasingly limited options. They could not bind Grandmother Silk. They could not create a being powerful enough to defeat her. Their numbers were dwindling, both from casualties of war and from the curse that made reproduction nearly impossible for their kind. As the conflict dragged on, it became clear that they could not win through direct confrontation. But the weavers were clever, and in their desperation, they conceived a plan that was both ingenious and terrible. If they could not defeat Grandmother Silk, they would imprison her. If they could not kill her without destroying themselves, they would put her to sleep. And if they could not maintain that sleep through their own efforts, they would trick others into doing it for them. Thus was born the concept of the Citadel of Song, a structure that would be both church and cage, a system designed to keep Grandmother Silk sealed in slumber while allowing the weavers themselves to be free of their burden. The plan required the combined silk and ability of all the rebel weavers. They would play magically charged harmonies, songs woven with power, to lull their mother into an unnatural sleep. They would wrap her in a cocoon of silk and place her in a cradle at the summit of a great structure. And then they would create a religion, a false faith, that would compel lesser bugs to continue singing the lullaby forever, maintaining the prison without ever knowing what they were truly doing. The execution of this plan would require a final, terrible battle. The rebel weavers, aided by mortal bugs who'd been goaded toward defiance by weaver influence, launched their assault on Grandmother Silk. The mask maker, speaking to Hornet much later, would recall this moment. Our mortal mob did once act some defiance. Unawares, maybe, but successful in part, goaded toward it by the weaver's will. The battle must have been catastrophic. Grandmother Silk was a pale being of immense power, the primal source of all silk, a creature who could dominate minds and reshape reality with her threads. The weavers, even combined, were merely her creations, elevated bugs with a fraction of her power. The mortal bugs who fought alongside them would have been like insects attacking a god. But somehow, impossibly, the weavers succeeded. Using their combined silk abilities, channeling power through carefully crafted runes and harmonies, they managed to do what should have been impossible. They cast down their pale monarch. They defeated a god. Yet even in defeat, Grandmother Silk could not be truly destroyed. Killing her might have meant the end of silk itself, which would doom the weavers whose very nature depended on it. Instead, they enacted their plan. They sang her to sleep with magically charged lullabies. They wrapped her in a cocoon of silk, a prison of her own essence. They placed her in a cradle at the highest point of what would become the Citadel of Song. The tethers that had enslaved the weavers were severed. Grandmother Silk's consciousness was suppressed, her influence dampened, her control broken. The weavers had achieved what no other created race had ever accomplished. They had overcome their creator and won their freedom. But freedom came with a price. The lullaby that kept Grandmother Silk sleeping required constant maintenance. The songs had to continue, unceasing and eternal. And the weavers, depleted by war and facing extinction due to their reproductive curse, knew they could not maintain this duty forever. So they constructed the greatest deception in Farloom's history. They built the Citadel of Song around their sleeping mother, creating a grand structure of stone and beauty. They usurped the position of deity that Grandmother Silk had held, establishing themselves as the divine figures worthy of worship. They used their power over bugs' minds and their skill with silk to launch a propaganda campaign, revising history, erasing the memory of Grandmother Silk from the collective consciousness of Farloom's population. Most importantly, they created a religious system that would compel bugs to sing forever, maintaining the prison without understanding what they were doing. Pilgrims would be drawn to the citadel by promises of holiness and salvation. They would climb the pilgrim road, endure trials, and if found worthy, join the eternal choir. Generation after generation of bugs would sing the songs that kept Grandmother Silk asleep, believing they were performing a holy service when in truth they were maintaining a prison. The poem Farloom's Folly, written by conductor Romino long after these events, captures the essence of this deception. They see your beauty, so frail and fine. They see your peace, woven of faith and toil. They forget your heart, bound in slumber and servitude. The bugs of Farloom saw only the beauty of the citadel and the peace of their ordered society. They forgot or never knew that at the heart of their kingdom lay a sleeping god, bound in servitude by the very faith and toil of those who worshipped in her name. A law tablet found in Mossholm near a Weaver Corps spire makes the deception explicit. Sister, spider, husk, bound to moss, watch over these bugs born low, raised up by fervour fostered, born and caught within our web unknowing. The pilgrims were caught in a web they didn't even know existed, raised up by artificially fostered fervour to serve a purpose they could never understand. With their mother imprisoned and their false religion established, the weavers entered a new golden age. They were free from eternal servitude. They were worshipped as divine beings. They ruled over Farloom with absolute authority. They had achieved everything they had fought for. But their victory, built on deception and maintained through exploitation, contained the seeds of its own destruction. Because truth has a way of emerging. Because prisons, no matter how carefully constructed, cannot hold forever. And because the weavers, in freeing themselves, had created a system every bit as cruel and exploitative as the one they had escaped. With Grandmother Silk imprisoned and their false religion established, the weavers faced the practical challenge of maintaining their elaborate deception across generations. They could not remain in Farloom forever. Their numbers were too few, their power was waning, and the burden of maintaining the eternal song was too great even for them to bear indefinitely. They needed intermediaries, loyal servants who could manage the day-to-day operations of the citadel while ensuring that the true purpose of the structure remained hidden. To solve this problem, the weavers founded 3 co-equal orders within the citadel of Song, each charged with specific responsibilities in maintaining the kingdom and the prison at its heart. These 3 factions, the conductors, the vault keepers and the architects, would become the ruling class of Farloom, inheriting both the weavers' duty and their authority. The conductors were established as stewards of Farloom, charged with guiding the kingdom's future and directing its decisions. They were the primary authority within the citadel, the ones who issued edicts and sanctioned projects. Most crucially, the conductors bore the responsibility of ensuring that the silk song keeping Grandmother Silk asleep never ceased. A rune harp given to conductor Ballador before the last weaver's death conveys the weight of this burden. Sisters, spiders, the burden is past. These simple bugs shall bear it full, never to cease, never to silence. The conductors appear to have been aware, at least initially, of the citadel's true purpose as a cage for Grandmother Silk. Conductor Ballador's possession of that incriminating rune harp suggests knowledge passed down through their order. Conductor Romino's poem Farlum's Folly speaks directly to the truth of the sleeping monarch and the deception that sustains her imprisonment. This knowledge seems to have weighed heavily on the conductors, creating a burden beyond merely managing the kingdom's affairs. The vault keepers were established as the preservers and protectors of knowledge. Housed within the whispering vaults, a vast library of scrolls and sacred texts, they were responsible for delivering sermons, leading prayers, documenting and preserving Farlum's history, and rooting out those not deemed sufficiently fervent in their faith. The vault keepers were scholars and clergy combined, maintaining both the historical record and the religious orthodoxy that kept the system functioning. The sacred psalm cylinders found in the Whispering Vaults contain various prayer songs, recorded melodies that could be played back using proper equipment. Among these is the melody of the Vault Keepers, 1/3 of the threefold melody needed to access the cradle where Grandmother Silk sleeps. The pontiff of the vaults held this melody jealously, covetously, with it being forbidden by law for a vault keeper to share their melody with anyone outside their order. This protection was not arbitrary. It ensured that regular pilgrims could never reach the cradle and discover the truth. The knowledge held by the vault keepers, both historical and mystical, gave them immense power within the citadel's hierarchy. Vault Keeper Cardenius, one of the few to survive to Hornet's arrival, mentions that his order viewed the acquisition of knowledge as a way to transcend their own minds and bodies. But their knowledge came with restrictions. Some truths, like the melody that would reveal the pontiff's discovery about the nature of the citadel's songs, were kept even from other vault keepers. The architects represent the most unusual of the three factions. Unlike the conductors and vault keepers, the architects were not bugs in the traditional sense. They were automatons, creations of cogwork and silk designed to imitate life. The 12th architect, one of the few to survive into Hornet's time, reveals the nature of their existence when speaking with her. Their hunter's journal entry explains that while their core is filled with fine mechanisms, that alone should not produce such convincing mimicry of life. Silk must also be used to animate this artifice, twining steel and mystical thread together to create artificial beings. The architects were charged with building and administering the cogwork core, the mechanical heart of the citadel that ensured all programs ran smoothly, all defences remained active, and all tasks were completed efficiently. Much of their craft was owed to tools and knowledge created by the weavers themselves, making the architects inheritors of weaver technology as well as weaver duty. The 12th architect speaks of their order with a mixture of pride and melancholy, describing their past glory: impressive, industrious, eternal. You have seen a glimpse, bug red, of us, how we once were, the minds of architects inspired, what majesty we did create. But the architect also reveals a darker truth about their existence. When asked about their purpose, they respond, "I am an architect, only an architect. To build, to automate, is not choice. It is our nature, directive, cage." The progression of words is significant. What begins as nature quickly becomes directive, and finally is acknowledged as cage. The architects were born into servitude, created specifically to serve the citadel, with no choice in their purpose. The architect's first major creation was the clockwork sentinels, a gleaming order of mechanical knights charged with the highest holy duty. According to the 12th architect, long before the creation of the core, the sentinels ventured even beyond the citadel walls to see all bugs brought, forced safe, to serve the citadel. The slip from brought to forced is revealing. The sentinels were not merely protectors, they were enforcers, kidnappers who captured bugs and brought them to the citadel whether they wished to come or not. Together, these three factions formed a hierarchical system designed to maintain the citadel's function indefinitely. Above them all stood the weavers themselves, the first children, revered as divine beings and ultimate authorities. Below the three factions came the devout, a complex hierarchy of choristers, clergy, priests, and soldiers. These organized the ranks of pilgrims and managed the endless stream of newcomers. Below them were the labourers who worked in forges, underworks, and factories, performing the physical tasks that kept the citadel functioning. At the very bottom were the simple pilgrims, newly arrived souls whose sin had yet to be judged and whose zeal had yet to be proven. The system was elegant in its cruelty. Faith provided both subservience and manpower. The citadel's religion offered a simple package: cleanse your sin through work, serve Farlum Eternal, and find your place in paradise. Those who didn't come willingly were brought by force through the sentinels. Once within the citadel's grasp, bugs were sorted and assigned roles based on their perceived worth and devotion. But even with this elaborate structure in place, even with three factions dedicated to maintaining the system, and an entire religion designed to sustain it, the weavers knew their creation could not last forever. The burden they were passing to these mortal bugs was too great, the deception too complex, the truth too dangerous. Eventually something would fail. Eventually the threads would fray. And when that happened, the weavers wanted to be as far from Farlum as possible. Despite their victory over Grandmother Silk and their establishment of a seemingly perfect system to maintain her imprisonment, the weavers came to a troubling realization. They could not keep their mother sealed in slumber indefinitely. Something about their plan was flawed, or perhaps Grandmother Silk's power was simply too great to be suppressed forever. Whatever the reason, it became clear that the citadel's song would not hold her sleeping permanently. The evidence of weaver anxiety about this impending failure can be found throughout the weave nests, those hidden facilities where the weavers had conducted their rebellion and research. In Weaveness Merglin in Bylewater, a lore tablet mentions that the weaver's silk would wane at some point, perhaps indicating that their power was fading, and they would be unable to maintain or strengthen the binding on their mother. In Weaveness Atla, the same facility where they had built their traps and researched their weapons, the tone of the lore tablet shifts from defiant preparation to something more desperate. The weavers experimented with various solutions. They had already attempted to create Eva, a divine being who might usurp Grandmother Silk, but that failed. They had built the snare setter and other binding devices, but these proved insufficient. Some weavers even ventured into the abyss, that void-filled depth that lies below all things, to research whether the dark substance found there might provide an answer. Weavenest Absalom, located deep in the abyss, contains evidence of these void experiments. Glass jars filled with the dark substance and runes depicting void tendrils. But nothing worked. Every attempt to permanently solve the problem of Grandmother Silk failed. The weavers could not create a being powerful enough to replace her. They could not devise a trap strong enough to hold her forever. They could not find a way to destroy her without destroying themselves, and they could not strengthen the citadel's song sufficiently to guarantee it would never fail. Faced with these failures and the certainty that Grandmother Silk would eventually wake, the weavers made a choice that defined them perhaps more than any other action in their history. they decided to flee. Rather than remain in Farloom and face the consequences of their actions, rather than continue seeking a solution, they would abandon the kingdom they had built and escape to distant lands where Grandmother Silk's influence could not reach them. In Weaveness Sindril, hidden in a secret room in far fields, Hornet can find a map depicting pathways out of Farloom. The nearby rune harp contains a desperate plea. Flee, sisters, flee until your strength exhausts. So far you may escape at last her silken sight, to start anew, to sustain, free of web and service eternal. The Weaver's exodus was not a single event, but an ancient diaspora that played out over time. Entire clans of sisters fled Farloom to distant lands, scattering in every direction in hopes of escaping the pull of Grandmother Silk's influence. Some travelled to the fringes of Hallownest, where they would establish themselves in Deepnest under the rule of Hera the Beast. Others went to lands unknown, seeking new homes where they might finally be free. But fleeing posed a significant problem. Abandoning Farloom would end the Citadel's song, hastening Grandmother Silk's awakening and dooming everyone left behind. The Weaver's solution to this moral quandary was the ultimate act of deception. They would hand control of the Citadel over to the bugs themselves, the three factions they had established, without fully explaining the urgency or fragility of the situation. In the crypto space, this technique is called a rug pull, promising something valuable while preparing to abandon it, leaving others to deal with the consequences. Despite their flight, the Weavers did not entirely lose hope. They prayed for one of silken strength to eventually come and free them from their web. The rune harp that Conductor Ballador possesses contains their last words, including this prayer: "We shall die and wait and pray that one may come of silken strength enough to weave us free." A few weavers chose to stay behind, prepared to wait through the ages for this prophesied saviour. They established weaver shrines throughout Farloom, sanctuaries where they prepared their final resting places. These shrines are remarkable structures, seemingly hewn from stone or else fossilized remains of weaver bodies. They both honour lives gone and preserve the spiritual essence of the deceased. The weavers interred in these shrines are suspended between life and death. Though they have long since decayed physically, the shrines carry their lingering silk memories and just enough soul to potentially resurrect them if the right variables align. When Hornet, a bug of weaver blood, approaches these shrines during her journey through Farloom, they activate automatically. Each tells her the same message: "Daughter of a distant land, we who remained have waited long. Bind our strength to yours, reclaim the future of our haunted kingdom." The weavers who remained did so with specific purpose: to wait for one of their own kind, one strong enough to finally solve the problem they had failed to solve, to free Farloom from Grandmother Silk's threat once and for all. The weavers also left servitors to watch over their weave nests and await their return. These constructs would guard the secrets and knowledge contained within those facilities, maintaining them through the ages in case they were ever needed again. With their prayers spoken, their shrines prepared, their faithful few left behind, and their maps to freedom in hand, the weavers departed. They left behind the kingdom they had built, the religion they had crafted, the prison they had constructed, and the sleeping god at the centre of it all. They abandoned the three factions and all the bugs who served the Citadel, leaving them to maintain a system whose true purpose they only partially understood. The weavers who fled to Hallownest established themselves in Deepnest, where Hera would eventually become queen. Having just escaped from one pale being, they had no interest in submitting to another, which explains why the Weavers of Deepness never fully submitted to the Pale King's rule. They had seen firsthand what servitude to a pale being meant, and they would not willingly enter that arrangement again. Hornet herself would eventually be born from the union of Hera and the Pale King, a child who carried both Weaver and Worm blood. The other Weavers watched over her closely during her youth, hoping to draw out her Weaver nature, as shown in the red memory that Hornet experiences during Act 3 of SilkSong. They whispered to her, encouraged her, tried to shape her. Prove yourself more Weaver than Worm. But Hera challenged this, telling her daughter, ignore them, daughter, their whispers. Greater, grander, Weaver, guardian, queen. Those are their desires, not your own. Certainly not mine. Only if you resist them you might see it. Another hope beyond. Hera seems to have understood what the other Weavers wanted from Hornet. They saw her strength as a pale being combined with her Weaver heritage, and they hoped she would be the one prophesied to return to Farloom and defeat Grandmother Silk. Hera, having no interest in this plan, encouraged Hornet to forge her own path, to choose her own destiny rather than accepting the one others wanted for her. The fate of the Weavers who fled to Hallownest becomes uncertain during the events of Hollow Knight. We see in that game that Weaver's Den in Deepness is completely abandoned save for one Weaver who can be spotted watching the night. The Weaver Song charm found in this area reveals that these Weavers actually left Hallownest for their old home, Farloom. But if that's the case, what happened to them? Where are they in SilkSong? One possible clue can be found in Weavenest Absalom in the Abyss. In this Weavenest, Hornet can find the Farsight item, a device that allows observation over vast distances. The design of this object vaguely resembles the Pale King, and its abilities parallel his foresight. It's possible the Weavers designed this device after encountering the Pale King in Hallownest and returning to Farloom. But if that's the case, where are they now? The mystery of the missing Hallownest Weavers remains one of the unanswered questions in SilkSong's lore. Perhaps they returned to Farloom and were captured by choir bugs sent to collect Weavers and their descendants. Perhaps they met some other fate in their journey. Or perhaps their story will be told in future content. Regardless, the Weaver's exodus marks the end of an era in Farloom's history. The first children, the false divine beings who had ruled the kingdom, abandoned it to face the consequences of their deception alone. They left behind a sleeping god, a fragile prison, and countless bugs whose lives would be consumed by a system designed to maintain something they could never understand. And in distant lands, the Weavers would continue their lives, always looking over their shoulders, always wondering if they had truly escaped their mother's silken sight, always hoping that one day someone else would solve the problem they had failed to solve themselves. With the Weavers gone, management of Farloom and the Citadel passed entirely to the three factions, the Conductors, the Vault Keepers, and the Architects. For a brief period the system functioned as intended. The Citadel hummed with thousands of voices singing harmonies that kept Grandmother Silk in slumber. Pilgrims continued to arrive, drawn by the bells and promises of the Citadel. The three factions coordinated their efforts to maintain the eternal song and preserve the kingdom's function. But the Weaver's memory proved to be a blind shepherd, and the flock strayed as days from their absence progressed. Without the first children to provide guidance and authority, without their mystical abilities to cloud minds and bend wills, the true purpose of the Citadel began to fade from collective knowledge. The three factions retained some understanding, particularly the conductors, but each generation knew less than the one before. Details were lost, priorities shifted, the mission began to change. What followed was a period painted dark by the Citadel's oppression, its corruption, and its exploitation of the masses. The religious system the weavers had created to maintain Grandmother Silk's prison became a tool for accumulating power and wealth. The nobility and leading members of the clergy, particularly the choristers and high-ranking vault-keepers, accrued immeasurable wealth through tithes gathered from lower castes. They manipulated notions of sin and penance to force bugs into lightless servitude. The concept of sin became a weapon. Any bug could be accused of sinning against the Citadel, and the punishment was invariably more work, more service, more exploitation. The Old Penitent, a bug locked away in the slab, Farloom's prison complex exemplifies how thoroughly this manipulation worked. Even after being freed by Hornet, he refuses to leave, saying, "By the grace of the Citadel, I am here as a penitent. Here I can hide from the shame of my sins until they are withered away by time. Leave this place, please. Strike me down dead before you speak such blasphemy again." The slab itself represented the extreme end of the Citadel's system of control. Built to punish those convicted of sinning against the Citadel, it housed not only prisoners but also jailers who were themselves trapped. The Old Penitent explains the fate of the guardflies who serve as jailers. They too are penitents. In a past age, that caste committed their own sacrilege against the Citadel, a sin long forgotten, but so grave that their offspring and the offspring of their offspring carry the guilt with them still. To serve here is their only hope of absolution. This reveals one of the Citadel's most insidious practices, generational punishment. The descendants of bugs who committed some ancient forgotten sin were born into servitude, forced to serve as jailers in the slab with no hope of escape. Their very existence was defined by a crime they never committed, perpetuating a cycle of exploitation across generations. Other bugs were born into specialized service as well. The squirm of the blasted steps were chosen by the Citadel to act as judges of pilgrims approaching the Grand Gate. A law tablet outside a squirm nest reads, "Bug born of Farloom, you have been chosen. May our citadels, holy gilding harden your soft shell, stand eternal as our arbiter, that no bug-bearing sin shall step within our sacred halls." These creatures were brainwashed from birth to believe they were performing holy work by using mallets to brutally bash in the heads of any pilgrim they deemed guilty of sin. Similarly, the Vault-born, found in the Whispering Vaults, were literally raised in dark vaults and forced to become scroll readers for the Vault Keepers, born into a caste with a predetermined purpose and no choice in their destiny. But the Citadel's cruelty extended beyond its own walls, affecting the regions of Farloom that existed underneath its influence. Greymoor, once a region that grew all sorts of food, was ordered by the Citadel to instead dedicate itself to catching silk dregs that drifted down from above and respooling them. The bugs of Greymoor had to resort to a less pleasant form of farming, breeding muck roaches for their disgusting roach guts. As Benjen and Krull, two residents of Greymoor, explain, their entire way of life was dictated by the Citadel's demands. The smog and exhaust produced by the Citadel was rerouted using the exhaust organ and dumped into what became bile water, polluting the region and transforming pristine waters into toxic swamps. This incurred the lasting hatred of the Stilkin, a faction of swamp dwellers whose lands were deliberately destroyed by the Citadel's waste disposal practices. The Stilkin would remember this crime, harbouring a deep resentment that would later explode into open rebellion. The Citadel even turned on its own protectors. The Pinstresses, an order of pin-wielding maidens who had once trained the Citadel's warriors, were systematically hunted down. As the last remaining Pinstress explains, "Our Grand Citadel learnt well from the training of Pinstresses past. Then it went and turned those teachings upon us. Despite our superior skills, our numbers have always been few and their strength overwhelmed. Only 2 Pinstresses survived the purge, hidden away in Farloom's forgotten corners. One became the seamstress, abandoning her violent past. The other remained in hiding at the edge of the blasted steppes, waiting, her purpose unclear. The Citadel's obsession with controlling every aspect of bug life extended even to death itself. A bulletin board in a Ventrica station reads, "Due to unacceptably high injury and unsanctioned deaths, Ventrica travel shall henceforth be denied to all. For Farloom Eternal, a bug who serves must never die." The Citadel didn't want its bugs to die, not out of concern for their well-being, but because dead bugs couldn't serve. Death became a sin, an act of defiance against the Eternal Order. This obsession with preventing death led to some of the Citadel's most horrific practices. In the surgical bays of Whitewood, bugs were offered the promise of immortality through silk infusion. The caretaker of the first shrine describes what happened there. Just think of them greedily shoving the silk into their shells, the madness that overcame them, eternal life for mortal bugs. The Oath of the Whitewood makes the Citadel's reasoning explicit. While song must be sung, none may falter. Infirmity, sickness, death, all are banished from our Citadel. But this silk infusion had consequences the Citadel may not have fully anticipated. Over generations and generations of using silk, Farloom became covered in silk dregs. The substance seeped into the very environment, into the water and air, and more significantly, it seeped into the shells of bugs themselves. The learned pilgrim, a bug who conducted gruesome research by cutting into other bugs, left notes describing what they found. In the air, the water everywhere, inside their shells, twisted inside, guts, tightest around heart, pulsing rhythm. The silk had worked its way into the very hearts of Farloom's bugs, wrapping around their vital organs, becoming part of their physical structure. The chapel maid and the caretaker conclude that the threads implanted into pilgrims from the Whitewood experiments would be carried down into their offspring, making future generations even more susceptible to silk's influence. This widespread silk infusion would prove catastrophic later, but in the meantime it enabled another of the Citadel's practices, the creation of silk flies and soul-powered automatons. When bugs infused with silk died, their bodies were piled high and burned in roaring cremation chambers. But their souls, bound to the silk within them, didn't pass on. Instead, they were harvested and transformed into silk flies, pale, luminescent creatures that carried the trapped consciousness of the deceased. These silk flies were then used to power the cogwork automatons that populated the Citadel. Every mechanical bug, every cogwork soldier, every automated worker was powered by a silk fly, by the soul of a bug who had died believing they were serving something holy. When these machines are destroyed in the game, silk flies escape from their broken shells, finally freed from their imprisonment. The souls of deceased bugs crying out in pain can be heard when Hornet plays her needle in near certain locations. Their fragmented words speak of eternal service, of devotion beyond death, of confusion about why they must suffer. These bugs had literally been turned into fuel, their very souls consumed to power the Citadel's machinery. The Citadel's ultimate expression of this philosophy came with the construction of the cogwork core, a massive structure of cogs and shafts at the heart of the Citadel. The last edict of the conductors celebrates its completion, and lo, is eternity sustained. By architect's claw, we welcome that final form of dial and rotor and soul gladly given, the perfect, unfaltering voice. The cogwork core was designed to sustain the eternal song automatically, built like a massive music box with cylinders covered in pips, with bells and cymbals in its depths, and with rows of statues capable of producing song at its peak. The core could maintain the lullaby that kept Grandmother Silk asleep without requiring living bugs to sing. Even the maintenance could be done by cogwork automatons. The act of singing, once the sacred duty of devoted pilgrims, had been outsourced to machines powered by dead souls. This might explain a peculiar detail about the Citadel's layout. The elevator at the entrance doesn't go up into the Citadel proper, but down into the underworks. If pilgrims weren't needed to sing anymore, they could simply be directed straight to the labour chambers, where their physical work could be extracted. The religious fiction could be maintained with minimal effort, and the Citadel could function as an efficient machine for converting living beings into exploitable resources. As the caretaker puts it, inside and out, it's nothing but a grand gilded lie. The Citadel had become a monument to hypocrisy and exploitation, the simple stone structure that pious Isamore described in ages past, bare and unadorned, with clergy who wore plain garb and ate sparse meals, had transformed into a gilded palace where the upper castes wallowed in luxury, while forcing those below into degrading servitude. The religion itself was fake, based on a deliberate lie. The ones being worshipped, the three factions, were not divine, but merely bureaucrats managing a prison. Even the worshippers were fake, replaced by mechanical statues singing automated songs. The Citadel promised eternal paradise to faithful pilgrims who climbed the long road and proved their worth. In reality, it plunged them into the underworks to labour until they died, then harvested their souls to power machines, trapping them in service even beyond death. It was exploitation refined to its purest form, a system that extracted every possible resource from every bug it touched, and then lied to their faces about it being holy. And yet, despite all this corruption and cruelty, despite the twisted perversion of its original purpose, the Citadel continued to function. The song that kept Grandmother Silk sleeping continued, if barely. The system ground on, consuming generation after generation of bugs. But the weavers had been right to fear the future. The Citadel's song could not hold forever. And Grandmother Silk, sleeping in her cradle at the kingdom's peak, was beginning to wake. It's unclear exactly when Grandmother Silk began to stir from her slumber, when her consciousness first started to push back against the songs that bound her. The transition from complete dormancy to the catastrophic awakening that would consume Farloom was gradual, a slow corruption that spread like poison through the kingdom's veins. The key to Grandmother Silk's awakening lies in the Citadel's own actions, specifically the practice of silk infusion that began in Whitewood. When bugs began incorporating silk directly into their shells, when the substance began wrapping around their hearts and seeping into their descendants, They unknowingly created a direct connection to the source of all silk. Grandmother Silk, as the primal wellspring of this substance, was entwined with all Farloom's threads. Even weakened and sleeping, she retained some influence over silk itself. Through this connection, Grandmother Silk's unconscious will began to seep into the minds of bugs throughout Farloom. Her threads, physically present within their bodies, became conduits for her influence. This is what would eventually be known as the haunting, but it didn't begin as a sudden catastrophe. Instead, it started as whispers, subtle influences, small corruptions that most bugs didn't even notice. The first signs were invisible and insidious, small voices in the back of bugs' minds, not quite their own, luring them from their intended paths toward actions that served Grandmother Silk's unconscious desires. The citadel began to change in ways that seemed like natural evolution, but were actually guided by the sleeping god's influence. One significant change was the citadel's turn toward increasing wealth and ostentation. Pious Isamor, the mechanical statue of a pilgrim now hidden away in the whispering vaults, represents the citadel's earlier, simpler form. Its recorded message speaks of simple stone bare and unadorned, of plain garb and sparse meals, warning that excess is sin. But as Grandmother Silk's influence grew, the citadel began to embrace exactly the kind of excess Isamor warned against. It became gilded and grand, a shining monument to wealth and power. The statue that reminded bugs of humility was hidden away, decommissioned, its message no longer convenient. The citadel also began more actively hunting for weavers and their descendants. Choir bugs were dispatched to lands beyond Farloom to track down and capture any bug with weaver blood. The cages used to transport these prisoners can be found in the cradle, each with inscriptions describing where the captives were found. One with an 8th weaver ancestry from the Sandsea Waste. Another 8th blood mortally wounded and taken from the Black Barons. A 1/4 ancestry weaver staked to service under the City of Steel. The choral commandment possessed by the bugs who captured Hornet reveals the scope of this operation. Full chamber to the kingdom of the White Worm. Claim the weaver, in half part, last of their line, sensed strong with silk, resistance anticipated, quell with rune cage. The phrase "sensed strong with silk" suggests that weavers could be detected from Farloom itself, possibly through Grandmother Silk's connection to all silk, allowing her to sense when beings with strong silk power existed in the world. Why did Grandmother Silk want the weavers captured? The game never explicitly states her motive, but the most likely explanation is that she needed their silken strength to fully break free from her prison. By binding these weavers to herself, draining their silk or incorporating their power, she could accelerate her awakening and strengthen herself for the confrontation to come. The environmental damage to Farloom intensified during this period. What had been pristine waters became the toxic swamps of bile water and the putrid nightmare of the putrefied ducts. The exhaust organ dumped ever more waste into these regions, and the constant smog and drizzle over Greymoor worsened. These changes weren't just the result of pollution, but seemed driven by something more. A corruption that spread through the land itself as Grandmother Silk's influence grew. Verdania, which might have survived longer than the other ancient kingdoms, finally fell during this age. One of its princes agreed to aid the citadel, his genius creating cogwork masterpieces used by the architects. The price for this aid was his body and soul, which were used to create the cogwork dancers, but his sacrifice was for nothing. Verdania died shortly after, leaving the Green Prince to languish in grief, a shadow of his former self. Scarsinger Carmelita, the ancient ant-queen, exhausted her voice singing a melody that resisted the corruption. Her song protected the hunter's march, maintaining life and growth in that region, even as the lands around it eroded to dust. But her mortal strength couldn't outlast an immortal being. She grew weaker with each passing day, her form withering, her power fading. The Scar tribe, which had remained unified for so long under her voice, began to scatter and lose themselves, uncertain if the song they heard was still their queen's or something else. The corruption reached even into the citadel itself. Members of the Pinstra's order, with their superior combat skills, were hunted down and destroyed, possibly because their strength was viewed as a threat to the increasingly paranoid citadel leadership. The 3 remaining sisters scattered, 2 hiding in remote corners of Farloom, while the 3rd fell in the putrefied ducts, her body left to rot. A snail shaman known as the Seeker attempted to organize resistance, travelling to Bilewater to seek alliance with the Stilkin. But Grohl the Great, chieftain of the Stilkin, killed the Seeker and took his soul powers for himself. The Stilkin's hatred for the Citadel burned hot after generations of having their lands used as a dumping ground, and they had no interest in working with anyone connected to that system. The most catastrophic change came when the Citadel finally fell into silence. At some point the eternal song that had kept Grandmother Silk sleeping for so long ceased. Whether this was because too many bugs had died, because the cogwork core malfunctioned, because Grandmother Silk's influence made maintaining the song impossible, or some combination of these factors, we cannot say for certain. But the result was inevitable. Without the lullaby to constrain her, Grandmother Silk's awakening accelerated dramatically. The haunting, which had been a subtle corruption, burst forth in earnest. Grandmother Silk's threads reached down from the cradle where she slept, spreading throughout Farloom like a plague, binding bugs to her will with physical silk that wrapped around their bodies and minds. Those who were caught in the threads found themselves enslaved to the pale monarch's unconscious desires, compelled to work toward her awakening. Pavo, the mayor of Bellheart, who would be temporarily caught by threads, describes the experience. It is difficult, upsetting even to think. Strange, sad memories not my own, and my own thoughts smothered amidst the tangle. If one could choose to connect themselves to something grander, that curse may seem a wonder. For myself, it now seems a horror. The haunting didn't just enslave the wills of living bugs, it could reanimate those who had already died. Under its influence, bugs long dead rose to their feet to mindlessly continue the tasks they had performed in life. The corpses shambling through the citadel, the dead pilgrims still trying to climb the pilgrim roads, these were all animated by Grandmother Silk's threads, puppeted from above like macabre marionettes. Not everyone fell victim to the haunting. Some bugs, like Poncatcher Reed and Ballow, resisted the force that claimed their peers. The reason for this resistance is unclear. Benjean and Cruel, 2 philosophers from Greymoor, offer their theories. It's faith that gets you. It's all caused by being too devout. Yeah, or maybe not being devout enough, or maybe it's safest not to think about it at all. Despite the humour in their dialogue, they might be partially correct. Those who were most devout, whose minds were most shaped by the Citadel's religion, and most filled with silk through the Whitewood's practices, might have been most susceptible to Grandmother Silk's control. And those who had never bought into the Citadel's promises, who had remained skeptical or resistant, might have found it easier to resist the threads. As the haunting spread, Farloom descended into chaos. The carefully maintained system of the citadel collapsed. Regions that had been dangerous but manageable became death traps, filled with maddened bugs and reanimated corpses. Settlements were overrun. The pilgrim roads, once protected by the citadel's forces, became wild and deadly. In the midst of this catastrophic awakening, Grandmother Silk took one more action. She spun 2 daughters entirely from silk, creating Phantom and Lace to replace the weaver daughters who had betrayed her. The creation of these silk-spun children might have occurred earlier, but the silk heart memory associated with Lace suggests otherwise. Better a child spun frail than none. Better a child spun pure than them. One to wish our waking. From our silk a child born loyal. The emphasis on loyalty, on having a child who would wish for her waking, suggests these daughters were created specifically to aid in Grandmother Silk's liberation. Unlike the weavers, who had imprisoned her, these children would be utterly devoted to their mother, incapable of the betrayal that had marked the previous generation. But even in creating her new daughters, Grandmother Silk repeated the mistakes of the weavers who had tried to create Eva. Being spun entirely from silk were fragile, flawed, and not quite what was intended. Phantom's shell stiffened and her silk stretched thin over time, leaving her withered and resigned to fade. Lace maintained her form better, but only through constant replenishment of silk, and she was tormented by the knowledge of her own artificial nature. A silk memory found in the exhaust organ captures Lace's anguish as she questions Phantom. She spun us to fade. She spun us to break. Why us, sister? Why us? Lace, who would later confront Hornet at the cradle, resented her existence as a crude mimicry of life, a child shaped to act but never truly alive. By the time Hornet would arrive in Farloom, the kingdom was in ruins. The citadel stood silent, its halls filled with corpses and its purpose forgotten by most. The regions below were plagued by the haunting, with bugs either enslaved to Grandmother Silk's will or driven mad by her influence. The ancient kingdoms of Karak, the Scar and Verdania were reduced to ruins and memories. The carefully constructed web of lies and exploitation that the weavers had created had finally collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty. And at the top of the citadel, in the cradle, where she'd been imprisoned for countless ages, Grandmother Silk stirred in her cocoon, preparing to wake fully and reclaim her kingdom. The threads she had sent forth were tightening their grip, pulling ever more bugs into her service, building toward the moment when she would finally break free from her silken prison and see all of Farloom bow before her once more. The folly of Farloom, warned of in Conductor Amino's poem, was coming to pass. The bugs had seen beauty so frail and fine. They'd seen peace woven of faith and toil. They'd forgotten the heart bound in slumber and servitude, and when she woke, they would see her truth, a beast's nature, bare to all. Into this dying kingdom came Hornet, daughter of Hera the Beast and the Pale King, princess of 2 kingdoms, protector of Hallownest, and inheritor of both weaver and worm blood. She was captured by choir bugs sent from Farloom, bound in a rune cage designed to suppress her considerable power, and carried back across vast distances to the haunted land of her ancestors. As the party of choir bugs entered Farloom's borders, something unexpected occurred. A silk fly appeared from nowhere and broke the rune on Hornet's cage, freeing her from her bonds. While never explicitly confirmed, the timing and nature of this action suggest that Lace, Grandmother Silk's rebellious daughter, may have been responsible. Lace would later demonstrate her ability to command silk flies, and she had her own complicated motivations for wanting Hornet free. Hornet escaped from her captors and began the long climb through Farloom toward the citadel, determined to discover why the veiled bugs had gone to such lengths to bring her there. Her journey took her through the ruins of a once great civilization, past abandoned settlements and fallen kingdoms, through regions corrupted by pollution and plague, encountering bugs driven mad by the haunting, and others desperately clinging to sanity. Along the way, Hornet met numerous pilgrims, each with their own perspective on the citadel and its promises. She encountered Quiet Pilgrim, Fearful Pilgrim, Aged Pilgrim, and many others, each demonstrating how thoroughly the citadel's mythology had penetrated into the consciousness of bugs throughout the known world. Even in Farloom's collapse, even with the kingdom clearly dying, the myth of the citadel still called to these souls, promising salvation that would never come. Hornet also discovered the corpses of her ancestors, the weavers who had remained behind to wait for one of silken strength. As she approached their shrines, they awakened, offering their power to her. Daughter of a distant land, we who remained have waited long. Bind our strength to yours. Reclaim the future of our haunted kingdom. Each binding increased Hornet's power, granting her new abilities and augmenting her silk reserves, preparing her for the confrontation that awaited at the citadel's peak. The journey was dangerous, filled with obstacles both physical and mystical. Hornet had to navigate lava, spike traps, thorns, falling rocks, deadly bells, scalding steam, and countless enemies. She witnessed strange rituals, broke bread with survivors, learned to play the needle-in that would unlock Weaver secrets, and stumbled upon the flame cult worshipping the Father of Flames deep in the Bonewood thicket. Hornet's path eventually brought her to Bellheart, where she witnessed the haunting's power firsthand. The residents of the town were suspended in air, bound and strung on silk threads as their minds were imprisoned by a lilting melody. The source of this curse was Widow, a weaver who had been captured and broken by the citadel, her mask forcibly removed and heavy pins lodged in her spine to prevent her from making her own silk. Stripped of her identity and her power, Widow had become a zealot for Grandmother Silk, using her remaining ability to strum music upon silk threads to bind Bellheart's residents to the haunting. After Hornet defeated her, she claimed Widow's power, binding the ancestral art of the needle-in to herself. This instrument would prove crucial in accessing Weaver secrets and understanding the memories preserved in silk throughout Farloom. Hornet faced two possible paths to the citadel. One route took her through the blasted steps, where she had to ring 5 bells located in bell shrines throughout Farloom and defeat the last judge at the peak. These bells, likely created by the Weavers as tools to draw pilgrims to the Holy Path, rang out across the kingdom when activated. The last judge, a massive bug who stood as final arbiter before the citadel's grand gate, tested the worthiness of any pilgrim who reached that threshold. Most were found wanting and killed. The alternate path led through Sinner's Road into the mist, a strange region of warped space filled with silk flies and vengeful wraiths. By playing her needle-in for the silk flies, Hornet could navigate this labyrinth to reach the exhaust organ, where she confronted Phantom. The silk-spun daughter desired a glorious death in combat rather than wither away in decline, and Hornet granted her wish, opening a path to the citadel through its hidden back entrance. Upon entering the citadel, Hornet found it seemingly empty until Lace appeared to taunt her. When Hornet mentioned that she knew a higher being was responsible for the haunting, Lace mocked her, saying she had no chance of defeating Grandmother Silk. Hornet replied, "I've found those who claim themselves a god can rarely match the title, and experience tells me even gods can fall." This defiant statement caused Grandmother Silk to scream, and the citadel came to life as her threads animated the corpses of countless bugs, filling the halls with shambling husks bound to her will. Hornet had to fight her way through the citadel's depths, ascending past the underworks where slaves laboured eternally, through the cogwork chambers filled with automated defenders, past the coral halls and the whispering vaults. In the first shrine, a bell awakened and called out to lost pilgrims, creating a haven called Songclave where survivors gathered. The caretaker who maintained this shrine engaged Hornet in philosophical discussions about the nature of pale beings, the burden of rule, and the choice between domination and liberation. To reach the cradle, Hornet had to complete the threefold melody by recovering the songs held by the three factions. She fought the cogwork dancers that guarded the lift to the cradle, beautiful automatons created from the soul and skill of Vidania's sacrificed prince. She climbed the cogwork core to reach the architect's melody. She delved into the whispering vaults to claim the vault keeper's melody from their deceased pontiff, and she ascended the high halls to receive the conductor's melody from the dying Ballador, last of his line. With all three melodies gathered, Hornet played the complete song before the statues representing the three factions, opening the lift to the cradle. But one final obstacle stood in her path. Lace herself, who challenged Hornet at the foot of the cradle, desperate to prove her worth to her mother, and resentful that Grandmother Silk desired Hornet instead of appreciating her own daughter. After defeating Lace, Hornet finally confronted Grandmother Silk, the Pale being responsible for everything that had happened in Farloom's history. The monarch was wrapped in a cocoon that pulsed with power, and their battle was climactic and terrible. Grandmother Silk demonstrated complete mastery of thread, pin and needle, her movements graceful and deadly, her power immense even after ages of imprisonment. But Hornet, carrying the strength of her ancestors, trained by Vesper, daughter of both Weaver and Worm, proved strong enough to overcome the Pale Monarch. She plunged her needle into Grandmother Silk, and what happened next would determine not just Hornet's fate, but the fate of all Farloom. The conclusion of Hornet's journey offers multiple possible outcomes, each revealing different truths about power, freedom, and the cycle of dominion that has plagued Farloom throughout its history. In the Weaver Queen ending, Hornet binds Grandmother Silk's power to herself, absorbing the pale being's essence and strength. The result is a transformation. Hornet's crest expands immensely, her masks transform into Weaver-style forms, and her body begins to change, growing additional pairs of arms. The entire citadel becomes covered in a thick web of silk, and Hornet finds herself curled in the cradle, becoming the new Pale Monarch of Farloom. This ending represents the fulfillment of the Weavers' original plan. They had hoped to create a being capable of usurping Grandmother Silk, and in Hornet that hope was realized. But this is explicitly not a happy ending for Hornet. She has followed the predestined path her Weaver ancestors wanted for her. Claiming the monarch's mantle she explicitly said she did not desire. In conversations with the caretaker, Hornet had made her true wishes clear. I'll not deny some part of me desires that outcome. Dominance, it seems, is baked deep in my blood, as too, no doubt, for the one up top. And yet another part resists. A part over time I find myself siding with more. That part wishes not to claim a monarch's mantle. Rather it would see my freedom regained, and this kingdom's bugs unshackled from their pale chains. The Weaver Queen ending is the opposite of Hornet's stated desire. She has become exactly what she fought against. A pale being dominating lesser bugs, continuing the cycle of subjugation that has defined Farloom's entire history. She has replaced one monarch with another, changed the face of power, but not its fundamental nature. The twisted child ending, accessed by completing Greyroot's ritual and keeping the parasite implanted until facing Grandmother Silk, offers a different but equally grim conclusion. In this ending, both Hornet and Grandmother Silk become encased in wood as the parasite completes its life cycle and escapes. The implications are unclear, but the image of Hornet trapped, transformed into something plant-like while something terrible is born from her suffering, suggests this is perhaps the worst possible outcome. The cut strung to serve ending, which may have been planned but is not accessible in the final game, shows Grandmother Silk overpowering Hornet and creating some kind of fusion between them. This being then sends threads down to enslave all the pilgrims below, suggesting Grandmother Silk succeeded in taking Hornet's strength, and is now free to dominate Farloom completely. But there is another path, one that leads to what the game considers its true ending, the conclusion that opens Act 3 and reveals the full scope of SilkSong's story. This path requires Hornet to work with the caretaker of the first shrine, who reveals himself to be one of 3 snail shamans living in Farloom, members of a race obsessed with power and soul magic. The caretaker proposes an alternative to simply replacing Grandmother Silk with another monarch. He speaks of a trap, one that could go further than mere binding, that could remove the pale monarch entirely and leave Hornet free from claiming her station. To create this trap, Hornet must gather 3 souls from the caretaker's family members: the chapel maid in Moss Grotto, the bell hermit beneath Bellheart, and the deceased seeker whose soul was taken by Groll the Great in Bylewater. Hornet must also retrieve the snare setter from Weavenest Atla, that weapon the rebel weavers created long ago in their failed attempts to defeat Grandmother Silk. With these components, the snail shamans construct a trap within the cradle, and when Hornet confronts Grandmother Silk, instead of binding her power, she drives it into the snare. The snare activates, revealing a gaping maw of void, that dark substance from the abyss that exists in opposition to soul and higher beings. Grandmother Silk threatens to drag Hornet into oblivion with her, but Lace intervenes, cutting her mother's arm to sever the connection. The silk-spun daughter rebels against the pale monarch, choosing to fall into the void with her mother rather than allow Hornet to be dragged down as well. This act of sacrifice reveals layers to Lace's character that weren't apparent before. Despite her resentment, despite her cruel mockery and her desire to kill Hornet, Lace ultimately makes a choice that saves the Weaver Princess. Perhaps she recognized in Hornet a kindred spirit, another daughter struggling against the expectations placed upon her. Perhaps she simply wanted to hurt her mother one final time by saving the child Grandmother Silk desired. Or perhaps, in that final moment, she found something like honor. But this victory comes with catastrophic consequences. The void begins spreading throughout Farloom, its tendrils climbing from the depths. binding themselves to the silk that permeates the kingdom. Black masses seep into bugs' shells, corrupting them with Void's influence. Violent earthquakes rack the land as Grandmother Silk, trapped in the abyss with her beloved daughter Lace, fights against the Void's consumption, creating more silk cocoons to protect them both. Hornet quickly realizes the situation. Grandmother Silk isn't simply being consumed by the Void, she's resisting, fighting to protect Lace, and her struggle is causing the earthquakes that threaten to destroy all of Farloom. The Pale Monarch's maternal love, ironically, has become the greatest threat to the kingdom's survival. Hornet tracks down the snail shamans at their ancestral shrine and confronts them about their deception. They admit they didn't anticipate this outcome, having assumed the Void would simply consume Grandmother Silk. But with Lace trapped alongside her mother, the pale being refuses to give up, creating an endless struggle that will eventually destroy everything. The snail shamans mention an old diving bell in deep docks that once reached the abyss. With Ballow's help, Hornet descends through layers of reality to walk the dark corridors of the Forsaken Realm. There she finds Grandmother Silk deep beneath the Void's surface, too deep for Hornet to reach without losing herself to the darkness. But Hornet remembers a flower from her past, the delicate flower from Hollow Night, known in SilkSong as the Everbloom. This flower possesses the rare ability to repel Void, as demonstrated when given to the Godseeker in Hollow Knight's Godmaster ending. The White Lady had called it the First Light, suggesting primordial significance. To manifest the Everbloom from her memories, Hornet must gather the hearts of Farloom's greatest warriors, those who ruled before Grandmother Silk arrived. She must use the Elegy of the Deep, a spell taught by the snail shamans, to enter preserved memories and face these legendary fighters in their prime: Crust King Khan, Skarsinger Carmelita, the primordial Nihilith, and the twin princes of Verdania. Each battle is epic, testing Hornet against the champions of Farloom's golden age. To save the future, she must destroy the past, slaying these leaders and claiming their hearts. With 3 hearts gathered, only 3 are required, though 4 can be obtained. The snail shamans perform a spell that consumes both the hearts and the shamans themselves, sending Hornet reeling through her red memories. In these memories, Hornet relives moments from her childhood, the Weavers trying to shape her, Hera encouraging her to forge her own path, training with Hive Queen Vesper, and finally confronting the White Lady about the creation of the vessels. The White Lady tells her, "You will think us harsh. You will think us uncaring, unrepentant, believing Hornet incapable of grasping the heavy burden of their choices." But Hornet replies simply, "You are wrong." She doesn't reject the complexity of their choice. She rejects the arrogance that assumes only a higher being can understand sacrifice. She proves that compassion is not a lack of understanding, but a stronger will than apathy. The White Lady offers Hornet the Everbloom, and Hornet awakens to find the 3 snail shamans have given their lives to grant her this power. With the flower in hand and aided by Ballow's repaired diving bell, Hornet descends once more into the abyss. There she faces lost Lace, the silk-spun daughter now corrupted by Void but still alive, still fighting. Hornet battles her way through the Void's influence, striking not to kill but to free, slowly cleansing Lace of the darkness that has consumed her. This is the crucial difference between Hornet and the pale beings who came before. She fights to save, not to dominate. When Lace is finally freed, Hornet shows Grandmother Silk that their desires align. Both wish to save Lace. The pale being offers what remains of her life force to fuel a silk shot to the surface, a final act of maternal love. But as Hornet and Lace rise through the void lake, the Everbloom's petals begin to disintegrate, and void tendrils move in to devour them. In one of the most significant moments in all of SilkSong's story, the Knight appears. The protagonist of Hollow Knight, now in its void-given focus form, arrives with the countless siblings who dwell in the abyss. The Knight and the other shades recognize Hornet as their sister, and they banish the void that threatens her, allowing Hornet and Lace to reach the surface safely. This moment confirms several crucial elements of the overarching Hollow Knight story. The Knight cares for Hornet enough to intervene on her behalf. The vessels those children created and abandoned by the Pale King have found some measure of purpose and agency. Hornet is truly a sister to the void, connected to that darkness through her familial bonds even as she opposes its hunger. On the surface, Hornet and Lace awaken. The void retreats back into the abyss. The tremors of Grandmother Silk cease. The pale monarch has finally been consumed, her sacrifice allowing her daughter to live. Farloom is freed from the haunted threads that have bound it for so long. This ending, called Sister of the Void, represents the best possible outcome for Farloom and for Hornet. The kingdom is liberated without Hornet becoming its new tyrant. This cycle of pale being dominance is broken. Bugs are freed from the system of exploitation that consumed countless generations, and Hornet remains herself, maintaining her freedom and her agency, refusing to claim the monarch's mantle she never wanted. The game ends with Hornet hitting Lace with the Weaver Stare while Lace laughs, a moment of levity that suggests these two characters, both daughters who struggled against their mother's expectations, might have found something like friendship in their shared experience. As we drift towards sleep, considering the full scope of SilkSong's tale, certain themes emerge that give this story its power and resonance. This is a story about lineage and the weight of ancestral expectations. The Weavers wanted Hornet to solve their problem, to defeat the god they couldn't defeat, to free them from the web they had woven. But Hornet chooses her own path, rejects the destiny others wanted for her, and finds a solution that doesn't require her to sacrifice her freedom. This is a story about the cycle of domination, how those who escape servitude often create new systems of exploitation. The Weavers, freed from Grandmother Silk's control, immediately established a religion just as cruel and deceptive as the one they had escaped. They justified their exploitation as necessary, just as their mother had justified hers. Only by breaking this cycle completely can true liberation be achieved. This is a story about the nature of truth and deception. The web of lies spun by the Weavers, claiming divinity they didn't possess, hiding their true origins, deceiving pilgrims about the Citadel's purpose, ultimately ensnared them as surely as it ensnared their victims. Truth has a way of emerging no matter how deeply it's buried, and lies, no matter how carefully maintained, eventually collapse. This is a story about mothers and daughters, about love twisted by power and control. Grandmother Silk created the Weavers to serve her, called them daughters but bound them as slaves. The Weavers rebelled and imprisoned their mother. Grandmother Silk created new daughters from silk. But even maternal love couldn't overcome the fundamental cruelty of creating beings designed to serve. Hera, by contrast, encouraged Hornet to forge her own path, to resist those who would shape her for their own purposes. The difference between controlling love and liberating love defines much of SilkSong's emotional core. This is a story about the price of freedom and the responsibility of power. Hornet could have taken the easy path and become Weaver Queen, claiming the power and authority that came with defeating Grandmother Silk. Instead, she chose the harder path, saving Farloom without dominating it, liberating bugs without ruling them, breaking the cycle rather than continuing it. And perhaps most importantly, this is a story about compassion and choice. Throughout her journey, Hornet helps those she meets, even when it offers no benefit to her mission. She frees Bellheart from Widow's curse. She assists bugs with their personal problems. She chooses to save Lace rather than let her die in the abyss, even though Lace had tried to kill her multiple times. These acts of compassion, of choosing to help rather than dominate, separate Hornet from the pale beings whose blood she carries. The complete lore of SilkSong, from the primordial age before Grandmother Silk, through the rise and fall of the Weavers to Hornet's ultimate triumph, spans countless generations and explores fundamental questions about power, freedom, truth, and choice. It's a tale worthy of contemplation as consciousness fades and dreams begin. Rest now, and let the silk-stained history of Farloom fade into your sleeping mind, where perhaps you'll dream of kingdoms that rise and fall, of daughters who rebel against their mothers, of heroes who choose liberation over dominion, and of the eternal struggle between the desire to control and the courage to set free. The kingdom of Farloom sleeps at last, freed from its haunting. May you sleep as peacefully, unburdened by pale chains, dreaming of worlds where even gods can fall, and freedom can be won through strength, compassion, and the refusal to repeat the mistakes of those who came before. Sleep well, child of distant lands, and may your dreams be filled with silk that heals rather than binds, with songs that liberate rather than imprison, and with the knowledge that even the longest night eventually gives way to dawn.